What if I told you that the street you might have walked down last week in Boston was once soaked in tea, guarded by cannons, and lit at midnight by a signal that changed the course of a war? Stay with me for the next few minutes, because I'm about to take you somewhere no camera could ever actually go. Using AI, I've brought old paintings, maps, and engravings back to life, giving them movement, depth, and perspective their original artists never had the tools to create. We're not just going to look at old pictures of Boston, we're going to walk through them. We're going to stand on docks that no longer exist, sit in taverns where rebellion was whispered over ale, and watch lanterns flicker in a church tower moments before history shifted forever. And stick around until the very end, because I'm going to show you what every single one of these places looks like right now, today, so you can see exactly what survived and what time swallowed whole. Let's go back to the very beginning, before Boston was even Boston. Picture a fleet of wooden ships cutting through gray Atlantic waves in 1630, carrying a group of settlers led by a man named John Winthrop toward a coastline nobody in that fleet had ever set foot on. No roads, no shelter waiting. Just trees, unfamiliar land, and a plan to build something out of nothing. Try to imagine what that first step onto the shore must have felt like. The kind of uncertainty where you don't know if you're walking toward opportunity or disaster, only that there's no turning back. That landing became the seed of everything that followed. Just a couple of years later, the settlers raised their first meeting house, a plain wooden building that served as the heart of the entire community. It wasn't fancy, it didn't need to be. It was where people gathered, worshipped, and made the decisions that kept a fragile settlement alive. What's wild is that the exact ground that building once stood on is now one of the busiest, most walked streets in downtown Boston. Thousands of people pass over that spot every single day, with absolutely no idea that this is where the whole story started. For a while, Boston stayed small. Muddy paths instead of streets. Modest wooden houses squeezed close together. Ships anchored just offshore, rocking gently while daily life crept along at a slow, careful pace. It wasn't a city yet. It was barely even a town. It was an experiment. A bet that a tiny colony on the edge of an unknown continent could somehow survive, and maybe even thrive. Looking back at it now, knowing everything that Boston would eventually become, there's something almost eerie about how ordinary and fragile it all looked in those early years. But give it a few decades, and everything changes. By the 1720s, Boston had transformed into a genuine port town, its harbor crowded with ships that connected it to Europe, the Caribbean, and beyond. This wasn't a sleepy settlement anymore. This was an engine of trade and ambition. One of the most important pieces of that engine was a massive wharf that stretched out into the harbor farther than almost anything around it. Ships loaded with cargo and passengers pulled in here constantly, and for a lot of newcomers, this wharf was the very first piece of Boston they ever touched. Rising up behind the docks were church steeples marking out the neighborhoods of the growing town, including one particular steeple in the north end that we're going to come back to later, because it's going to matter a lot. Before ships even reached that wharf, though, they had to pass a lighthouse standing on a small island at the mouth of the harbor, completed in 1716. For sailors who had spent weeks or even months crossing the open ocean with no guarantee they'd ever see land again, this light was the first proof that the journey was finally ending. Just imagine that feeling. Total darkness, endless water, and then suddenly, a flicker of light on the horizon telling you that you made it. During the War for Independence, retreating British forces destroyed that original lighthouse rather than let it stand. But Americans rebuilt it just a few years later, and remarkably, it's still standing guard over that same harbor entrance today, making it one of the oldest lighthouse sites still in continuous use anywhere in the country. Guarding the approach to the harbor was a heavily armed fort perched on its own island, a clear and constant reminder that this port wasn't just a place of trade, it was a place under watch, firmly under the control of a distant empire. Every ship that passed those cannons knew exactly whose authority they were sailing into. Cross the river, and you'd find yourself at a small college campus that most people at the time probably walked past without a second thought. It was nothing like the massive institution it would eventually become. Back then, it was just a handful of buildings meant to train ministers and community leaders for the colony. One of those original buildings, finished around 1720, is still standing on that same campus today, making it the oldest surviving structure there. It's strange to think about how unremarkable that place must have felt to the students walking across the yard, completely unaware they were standing at the starting point of something that would eventually matter to the entire world. Head back into the heart of town and you'd run into the building where colonial power actually lived. the seat of government, where laws got argued over, taxes got imposed, and royal proclamations were read out loud to crowds gathered in the street below. This wasn't just an office. It was the stage where the relationship between the colonies and the crown played out in real time, argument by argument, tax by tax. Remarkably, that same building is still standing in the middle of modern Boston today, quiet, boxed in by skyscrapers, one of the rare survivors from that era that you can actually walk right up to. Not far from there sat a stretch of open land used for grazing animals, holding public gatherings and running military drills. British soldiers trained here constantly, often within full view of townspeople just going about their day. It was ordinary and tense all at once. Kids running around, animals grazing, soldiers marching, all sharing the same patch of grass. Overlooking it all stood the official residence of the royal governor, a constant visual reminder of exactly who was really in charge. Today, this space is still a public park in the middle of the city, and if you stood there right now, you'd never guess that just decades before independence, this quiet ground doubled as a stage for imperial power flexing its muscle in plain sight. Now here's where things start to boil over. In December of 1773, a group of colonists boarded ships anchored in the harbor and dumped chest after chest of tea straight into the water, a direct and calculated protest against British taxation. Some of them disguised themselves to hide their identities, and also to send a message that this act belonged to the colonies, not to any single group of individuals. Nobody at the time called it a tea party. It wasn't playful. It was cold, deliberate, and dangerous, and it pushed the relationship between Boston and the Crown past the point of easy repair. Protests like that didn't just appear out of nowhere. They were built, argument by argument, inside places like a certain tavern that became one of the most important meeting spots in the entire town. On the surface, it looked like any other place to grab a drink. But behind closed doors, merchants, dock workers, craftsmen, and organizers gathered constantly to trade information, vent frustration, and quietly plan resistance. Groups working toward independence used its private rooms to plot protests and coordinate their next moves. Revolutions rarely start with a single dramatic speech. More often, they start exactly like this, in ordinary rooms, over ordinary drinks, with people who are simply tired of being pushed around. From there, the frustration spilled into a public hall that quickly earned a reputation as the beating heart of civic life in the town. Downstairs was a market, upstairs was a hall packed shoulder to shoulder during debates over taxes, representation, and the growing weight of British control. This was where private anger turned into public action, where speeches lit fires that spilled out into the streets outside. That same building is still standing today, and it's still one of the most visited landmarks in the entire city. Then comes the Signal, a quiet Anglican church in the North End, finished back in 1723, had spent decades as an unremarkable part of everyday neighborhood life. Nothing about it suggested it would ever matter beyond its own congregation, but one night, 2 lanterns were lit in its tower, a simple, silent warning that British troops were moving by sea. In an instant, an ordinary church became one of the most famous landmarks in American history. That tower is still standing, still watching over the same streets, decades and centuries later. And then, after years of tension, protest, and war, comes the moment that made it all worth it. In 1789, the streets of Boston were dressed for celebration, as a temporary wooden arch was built to welcome the very first president of a brand new nation. That arch was designed to look like solid stone, giving it an air of permanence even though the country it celebrated was barely a few years old. Just a short time earlier, these same streets had been filled with protest, fear, and uncertainty. Now they were filled with cheering crowds watching a new nation step fully into its own existence. Imagine standing there in that moment, watching a place you'd known your whole life transform in real time, from a colony fighting for something into a nation that had actually become something. So here's the real question. If these old buildings, harbors, and church towers could talk, what do you think they'd tell us that no history book ever could? Which one of these locations would you want an AI recreated video tour of next? Drop it in the comments, because your ideas genuinely shape where this series goes from here. And if this kind of time travel storytelling is something you want more of, you know exactly what to do. Until next time.